Friedrich Engels famously explained that, under communism, the state will gradually wither away, rather than being abolished in one fell swoop. The withering away of the state, or, to flex my German knowledge, the Absterben des Staates, is a somewhat well-known Marxist concept. What does that have to do with competitive Overwatch? Very little. But we are also seeing, in real time, the withering away of the distinction between main support and flex support, and have been on and off fitfully for years. And that is the topic I would like to cover in today's video. Now, if you're watching this channel, you have at least some familiarity with competitive Overwatch and the basic terminology of it, and because of that, you probably know which characters and even pro players are flex supports and main supports. Still, the etymology of this distinction, where it came from, is surprisingly unknown, and I think even people do know, they often have wrong or misleading stories to tell about it. So I want to contribute my own. First of all, I want to contribute my own story, my own belief of how exactly these terms came to be, and I'm pretty confident I'm right. And fellow old heads, including people even older than me, because I started watching competitive Overwatch in 2017, and some of you, I'm sure, began watching in 2016, maybe even 15. Did they have it in 15? I think they might have. So you can correct me, but I'm pretty confident I have it right. The basic version was that Lucio was so good that one support's job was basically to exclusively play Lucio, and the other support's job was to play like every other support. So to prove this, I'm going to briefly show some VODs and just kind of skip around to show you the kind of comps that were run at the time. So you see here, Lucio Mercy, right? Go here. Lucio Zen, that was the popular one, and I think it ended up being the strongest on a lot of maps in 2017. Most maps, if not all. Envious is on some bullshit, but Lucio Ana, Lucio Zen, you know how it goes. And we can continue. Lucio Ana, Lucio Zen, and even Envious started to run Lucio Sombra. One support, and this was pretty common. The idea behind the Sombra was, for those of you who don't remember, Sombra would get ult charge toward EMP from people healing themselves with hacked health packs. And Lucio was so strong, and his AoE so big, and all that stuff, and even his HPS so high, that at this time, you could genuinely just run Lucio Sombra. And one, because you'd have all these hacked health packs, your team could still find healing that way. But two, you'd have EMP almost every fight, so you could kind of get away with only having one support. It was really common on 2CP in particular, while Skye and Anubis had really accessible, useful health packs that allowed this to be good. It was very silly. So flex support then, basically, flex support and main support were named such because the main support was always on support, really always on Lucio, and the flex support was most of the time on support, but not always on support, because they might be on Sombra or what have you. And at the very least, right, main support played one character, and flex support played a bunch of characters. So those, I think, are the two intertwined reasons that the roles are named such. That one role would play one character, would main one character, and one role would flex. But also, one role was exclusively on support heroes, and one role was on support heroes plus the occasional DPS, i.e. Sombra. So there's that. That is, in my opinion, I'm pretty sure, really, because this is a fact, not an opinion, that this is where the distinction came from. People will mislead you with similar but different explanations, or incredibly counterintuitively say that it is some attribute of the characters themselves. But this is a mistake. Rather, the main support flex support distinction is just downstream of the division of labor of the support combinations that people tended to make throughout the history of the game, and the hero pools that would be expected of the two support players on a team. There's nothing about the characters themselves that automatically make them a main support or flex support. It only comes down to how they tend to be used in a professional setting. As time passed, naturally, Mercy switched teams from being considered a flex support to being considered a main support mainly because after she was buffed and reworked right before the first season of Owl, in the first season of Owl, you had to have a Mercy at all times. Moreover, your other support would be on Zen most of the time. So the person who was already good at Zen would just keep playing Zen, the flex support. And the main support, who probably had less mechanical skill, or their mechanical skill was almost exclusively Lucio mechanics, would be expected to play Mercy because the hero was easier. Moreover, there was still a little more flexibility for the flex support than for the main support. So again, we see that classic dichotomy of the flex support plays different characters and the main support plays one character, even though the one was now Mercy rather than Lucio. It stayed like this. It stayed like this to this day. Mercy is still a main support. And in general, for the vast majority of Overwatch 1, these categories stayed pretty rigid. In Goat's comp, Goats was itself interesting, but in that composition, um, Lucio was further entrenched as the main support hero, because if you were a main support before Goats, you would just be expected to play Lucio, because that was a mechanically demanding hero and a hero that had been around for a while. Likewise, the flex support was further entrenched as someone who played Ana, Moira, and Zen, though as people understood Goats better, they realized Zen was the best hero. And Ana in Goats was limited to team-specific comfort and especially Winston Goats, and Moira mostly fell off entirely, though she was used more with Rhine Goats, i.e. traditional, and was also again a counter comp to certain other stuff. But as we know, the best 6 heroes for Goats were Zen, Lucio, Brig, Zarya, Rhine, Diva. Naturally. Once Baptiste came out, he also settled into the mantle of flex support hero, but this itself was a bit divisive, or at least confusing. And if there's one hero that I think really straddles the main support flex support divide the most, and especially for the longest, it would probably be Bap. Because Bap Zen was a really common comp, but so was Bat Brig, and especially as the meta evolved, and in order to protect the Bat from Tracer, Bat Brig became the most common. But really, with the release of BAP and with Role Lock, we didn't really see exceptions to the idea that you have one flex support player and one main support player, and the main support player is Lucio Brig, and the flex support player is everybody else, until 2020 and 2021, at least in the Overwatch League. With this, we saw, again, the first players and comps that challenged the old idea of this role dichotomy. For the Philadelphia Fusion was one early adopter, in part because Alarm, may he rest in peace, was incredibly flexible. Alarm was the rare case of a support that could truly play everything, and so Alarm's other support, Reed, Funny Astro, would often switch around to adapt to him. So here we have a main support on BAP, for example, which is very funny because most of us know Funny Astro today, rightfully, frankly. In fact, I imagine he'd admit it himself as a Lucio one-trick. But when you wanted to play BAP Zen, you wanted Alarm on Zen. So Funny Astro would be forced to play the BAP, and unfortunately, that had its problems. Again, you see why they would want Alarm on that hero. Again, BAP Zen was not hard meta really at any point, because it was still too weak to Tracer and flankers writ large. But especially if you knew what the enemy was going to run, if you thought they weren't going to run a flanker, Zen BAP was a really nice counter comp that played into some people's comfort. You see Dante insta switches to Tracer to try and deal with this. Another fun tidbit in this particular VOD, which I picked sort of randomly, just trying to find something with BAP Zen, is that Houston is on Winston Sigma. Winston Sigma could get a video all its own, and that was something else, but it's really one of those tank duos that no one thinks about, because they really don't have synergy. They didn't even have synergy at the time. It's incredible. What's even funnier about this particular VOD is that there weren't even hero pools like banning Diva or something. Houston was just on Winston Sigma for the love of the game. Winston Sigma could get an entire video its own. I think that's a little much, but maybe I'll do one on like weird tank duos or more on weird comps or bad synergy or something. I don't know, because Winston Sigma was really silly. In fact, it's kind of an early, I mean, they split, so it's kind of an early, because of course they split, how can the Sigma follow a dive? So it's almost an early example of how Winston would have to be played in Overwatch 2, where he dives on his own to kind of get space and get ult, rather than just hard commit with like 3 other people onto the backline, though he can do that too, of course. But yeah, Winston Sigma, that's a great one. Back on topic though, in OWL 2020 and 2021, as the Rollock era came around, BAP Zen was one of the first challenges to the old dichotomy, and now you would have two flex supports, or a main support might be expected to play Baptiste. Some players also began to come around who actually flouted the entire idea of being good at Lucio, which for years, and arguably to this day, was the hallmark of the main support. One of the main players that come to mind, one of the most interesting and innovative, was probably Skewed, who I'd mentioned a bit in my last video even. Wait, no I didn't, sorry. Skewed, who was essentially a Brig Zen 2 trick for the LA Gladiators, but this was actually fine. This was not a problem for them because they delegated the Lucio ing exclusively to Moth, and they really wanted to 2-trick Ball Comp and Orisa Comp. So with Orisa Comp, they could have Shu on Bap and Skewed on Brig, or Shu on Bap and Skewed on Zen, and then when they play Ball Comp, they could just have Shu on Zen and Skewed on Brig, and they didn't really play Rhine Rush or anything involving Lucio enough for Skewed to have to worry his pretty little head about playing Lucio. And as we know, the LA Gladiators in 2021 was an incredibly good team. Like, this is a real contender, so this was not some dumb gimmick or unworkable strategy. It worked great, and it was the first inkling that you could consider yourself a main support or be not, right, the flex support, because obviously she was the flex support, but still play Zenyatta a lot, or challenge the idea that you have to know how to play Lucio, things like that. Violet naturally was also an early innovator in this regard. Obviously, Violet is known pretty well today for sort of making the switch, so to speak, from main support to flex support. It's the other way around, from flex support to main support. But as early as OWL 2021, Violet began playing Lucio quite a bit. And again, here's another example of Bap Zen, actually. Violet goes Lucio later. And what's even funnier about this is that, again, Shock have 2 flex supports in. There is no main support in this lineup. Violet might go Lucio later, we'll see. I think he doesn't, though. I think they stay bunker for a while, at least on Kings. And in fact, yeah, what ends up happening is they also want Violet on BAP, so they have Twilight go Brig, which is, again, you just see that these roles are, fitfully for specific teams who want to buck the trend, begin to be challenged. You see Twilight, a career flex support, still a flex support in Tier 1 to this day at the time of recording this, going Brig. Meanwhile, the Outlaws adhere to the divide incredibly rigidly. Juby exclusively played Brig, Mercy, and Lucio for his team. There we go, he's on Mercy, so they can play Echo. Things like that. But you see how, again, as early as 2020 and 2021, this dichotomy, see there's Violet and Lucio, began to be challenged at least a little bit. Another noteworthy, however, even in spite of this, compositions were basically double flex support, as it were, if anything. You would not really see a double main support comp for some time, but this too would change. The only exception to this rule is a really cool comp that some of you may have heard of, called Arab Dive. This is already kind of cool because it's a rare example, at least in Overwatch, of something that I always find really interesting, which is in-game compositions having a real-world geographical identity. This is something that I've always just found really cool. The other day I was watching the video where BKC and Blunder watch old Smog Tour replays, like Smogon Tournament replays, and they talk about how certain team styles or team structures can, to the experienced player, instantly be parsed as Italian, for example. A few other regions as well. There's also the phrase Chinese EV spread, where in, I think, like NatDex Ubers, I want to say, where Chinese players were known for really interesting and innovative and complicated EV spreads. I also instantly think of, in Smash Ultimate, rolling to ledge, so you grab their neutral getup and then back throw them, was called the Tri-State Twister by Coney, because Tri-State players, including one who's banned now, so I'm not going to say his name, but Tri-State players would always do it. And now it's like a pretty common thing. It's just a nice mix-up to catch a neutral getup if that's their ledge option, but yeah. So that's always really cool. I would love to see Overwatch have more of that. Of course, Arab here basically refers to Yazan, and in general, the preference or tendency for Saudi Arabian players to be really good at Farah. that could, if handled with tact, be a video all its own. And I think it's a complicated thing, though I think it comes mostly from the fact that there used to be, and maybe still is, a really strong PS4 Overwatch community in Saudi Arabia. And Farah, as some of you might know, is way better on console than she is on PC. But then when these Saudi players started to move to PC, they continued forcing Farah, and so she became a hero with a very strong regional identity. And so Arab Dive is this composition, and it is a rare, especially for the time, double main support comp. Mercy, Lucio. Now, the way this comp came about, and this is a little bit of hearsay and a little bit, I believe Spilo mentioned this in a video I watched a few weeks ago that I remember hearing about this at the time too, was that this team originally just ran Mercy Ana. They played Ball because they had a Wrecking Ball one trick, and because he synergized with Farah, and they played Farah because they had Yazan. And the basic premise of the comp, even in its Mercy Ana form, was give the Farah as many resources as possible. Ball and Farah have really nice synergy because Ball is so self-sufficient that you really can devote a Mercy exclusively to damage boosting a Farah. That's also why you have Tracer. If she needs healing, she gets health packs. And the Ana was also there to basically just play incredibly far back on the map where nobody could see her, and would pocket the Farah if she could, and especially nano the Farah, because nano barrage and just nano Farah without barrage was incredibly strong and a good way to just let the Farah dominate the lobby, which Yazan could do if given sufficient resources. That's why Yazan's weird Farah teams did so well in European contenders. However, naturally, when you fight some off-meta team, you're always going to try and figure out how the hell you can crack it. Like, what's the secret to blowing your comp open? Because there must be, or else it would be meta. And some team realized, again, this is the kind of hearsay or inherited knowledge that I believe is correct. Some team figured out that even when the Ana is just playing in Narnia, you can still just send a Tracer after her and kill her. So eventually, the Ball Yazan team's adaptation to that was to replace the Ana with a Lucio. And if you think about it, or as I will argue, Lucio was really the only replacement you could make. Zen could work, but he runs into the same problem as Ana, where even if you play in Narnia, you're still really squishy. Whereas Lucio, unlike any other support you could pick here, he could go with someone and do something, rather than just sit in the back of the map and poke. Because if he was going to sit in the back of the map and poke, then he could just be Ana. But the Lucio goes with the D.Va and or the Tracer and goes on dives. In this sense, Arab Dive was really years ahead of its time, because this is now just the accepted role of Lucio in 5v5. But he was doing this in 6v6, because he just needed to find value. Hempei just needed to find value, because Ana just couldn't work, and he needed some way to stay alive while still contributing to the team. Because I think that's the problem with, like, Brig and Moira. Like, you could go Brig or Moira, and I suppose they could just survive and live a dive, but then they wouldn't do anything. They'd just be holding out against the Tracer, and eventually the Tracer would finish them off anyway. Whereas Lucio is not just, I'm going to sit in the back of the map, but if you get on me, I can get away. No, he does something, and because of his mobility, he can still get away if the Tracer tries to chase him. That's the idea. Still, Arrow Dive is a diversion and a strange, unusual off-meta edge case that basically was only used to great success, at least in Tier 2, by like one team. I was on an amateur team in BPL that used Arab Dive a bit, because I could play Mercy and my other support could play Lucio, and we had a Farah that we just tried to pocket as much as possible. It was fun times. But again, still kind of niche. Another fun thing about this comp, even at low level, was that the Lucio player was pretty free to like do whatever he wanted. The best thing for him to do was to accompany the Tracer and or the D.Va when they did stuff, but he also could just kind of roam the map on his own and be a little shitty green Tracer and just be a flanker in his own right, if he could get away with it. Like, that was a way to get value too, especially outside of top level. So Arab Dive was really fun to play, even though it was admittedly very off meta. Arab Dive never saw Overwatch League play, or barely saw Overwatch League play, primarily because most teams didn't really care for Farah. They either didn't have someone who was good enough at her, and Farah in general kind of falls off at a tier 1 level. It actually reminds me of another thing, which is that it was actually pretty hard to find VODs of Arab Dive, especially as played by Avoided, the team who invented it. A lot of the European contenders games, even like important consequential games like Grand Finals is, just weren't even streamed or recorded anywhere. Certainly nowhere permanent. And some of the ones that were supposed to be recorded have still been lost. Like the channel has privated the videos or deleted them or what have you. And certainly any Twitch VODs have been lost. So, Arab Dive is a little bit obscure to find VODs of it being played by the team that invented it, but they're out there, I think. And so that's why some of the footage I had to gather for this section is from such varied sources as Avoided playing in trials with a slightly different roster and often on slight variations of the classic double main support comp. You know, an Ana here, a Zarya over Diva, Lightbringer playing Torb, as well as a highlight montage made by Ball/Chasm himself that actually does feature a bunch of real contenders footage, and also a stream of myself playing on a team that ran Arab Dive in 2021, and I was even worse at the game back then. So, you know, I was kind of running it down, but fond memories nonetheless. And more importantly, if anyone does have some of these lost or unrecorded, at least on Wikipedia, EU Contenders VODs from 2021, especially the Avoided versus British Hurricane Grand Finals, and I don't know, like has replays on their PC, even coaching VODs, whatever you've got, if anyone has those, uploading them or otherwise sharing them with me would be quite nice. Because right now, Arab Dive, at the peak of its meta relevance, is lost media. Oh my god, Bat Chest. But seriously, this stuff is lost right now, so any footage would be very much appreciated if anyone has some. So by all means. But again, double main support, at least in Overwatch 1, was really only seen then. But that wouldn't last. Even as these categories mostly stayed pretty rigid in Overwatch 1, besides these edge cases like Violet, Twilight, Skewed, Alarm, and so on, the categories would be blown open at least a bit by Overwatch 2. First of all, and this is a minor point that ended up not even being true, when Overwatch 2 was first announced to be 5x5, for some reason the consensus theory craft about it was that in Overwatch 2, double flex support would be the best composition, and not only would off-tank players be out of a job, but main support players would be out of a job, that you just play Ana Zen all the time. I'm not exactly sure why this became the consensus line of reasoning, but it was. I think my best guess is people decided that if there was only one tank, then if there was only one tank, then you wouldn't have a diva anymore, because solo Winston would be better than solo diva most of the time, and therefore you wouldn't really be able to successfully dive like an Ana Zen backline without just getting killed or poked out. In general, Ana in Overwatch 1 was mostly kept in check considerably by the frequency of Diva and Sigma. If the off-tank didn't exist, Ana's nades and so on wouldn't be eaten, and she'd probably have seen a lot more use or gotten a lot more utility in Overwatch 1. But the off-tank as a role kind of kept Ana's bullshit in line at least a bit. So I think when people first heard about and theorized about 5v5, they figured that Ana would just run train on everything, and that, again, you wouldn't need a Brig to babysit her because you could just have a Zen. You would just poke out the enemy tank before he could touch you. However, as some of you may know, once we actually got our hands on Overwatch 2, and once really OWL players got their hands on Overwatch 2 in the alpha and beta, before even the betas were released to the public, Ana Lucio ended up being the first meta of Overwatch 2. As it turns out, even with one tank, Ana Zen was often, not always, but often too squishy, and Lucio could perform the various miscellaneous jobs that there was no longer an off-tank to do. Contesting high ground, displacing people, marking flankers, and especially sitting on the payload. Because, as some of you might remember, when OWL first started playing Overwatch 2 at the beginning of Season 5, people would C9 all the time because it was the off-tank's job to get point. And now that there was no off-tank, it took people a while to sort of understand how that role should now be distributed. Because it was now decentralized and sort of, depending on you know, it could be like the Tracer's job or the Lucio's job. After Kiriko came out, it could often be the Kiriko's job. You know, contesting point was no longer just the thing the off-tank did like it used to be in this. It took a while for people to get their hands around and fully understand. Still, even in early Overwatch 2, for the first 2 stages, rosters mostly abided by the classic rule. You have a flex support player who plays Ana Zen, and you have a main support player who plays Lucio Brig, and you have one of each. But in the 3rd stage of Season 5, things changed. The 3rd stage of Owl Season 5 saw the release of Junker Queen, and this led, as some of you might remember, to one of the most centralized metas of all time. This meta, where the best composition on basically every map with a theoretically perfect roster who could play every hero at high level, was Genji, Sojourn, Junker Queen, Brig, Lucio. No exceptions, no diversions, ever. You know the symmetries here, these are for rollouts. It's interesting to people who might know a bit more about Overwatch and how these comps have often looked, and especially to people at the time, that this composition saw Lucio Brig instead of Lucio Moira. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but I do have some ideas as to why Brig might have been the choice. One of the main ones is that Junker Queen was new and Junker Queen was incredibly broken at the time. And I think Junker Queen offered so much overhealth and so much overhealth that you could get away with the relatively low healing provided by Brig Lucio. Moreover, what else? Brig also provides a more useful kind of healing for a Genji Sojourn than Moira does, because it's longer range and it's a burst. Moira can only heal people right in front of you. But again, this is Overwatch 2, people already begin to understand that the best way to play Overwatch 2 is with teams sort of split 3-2 or what have you, to establish map control and take a bunch of angles. In fact, just so we can have the correct VOD as something to watch, I want to show you something that I noticed when I started watching this is... Look at this rollout. This is how solved... Actually, wait, hold on. Let me go forward a few seconds. This is how solved this meta was. This is how solved this meta was. All 5 heroes are in the exact same position. Oh, man. The Brig and the Queen go together. The Lucio and the Genji take an off angle together, shutting down these 2 angles near enough for the Lucio to heal the Genji. And the Sojourns do a sim out of spawn for the fast rollout, and then switch to Soj. Once the Soj gets here, I think she'll play stacked on the Queen Brig. But this is how centralized this meta was, and now I'm going to let this play so we just have something to watch. But was serious business. Anyway, yeah, I think Brig was played right because of the healing she could provide. And also, Junker Queen had so much self-healing herself that Junker Queen could get away with the lower healing numbers provided by Brig. Junker Queen didn't care, because she could self-heal in so many ways. She didn't need the extra healing offered by Moira. Moreover, the Queen comp was so aggressive and so brawly that Brig could actually have enough Inspire to reliably have good uptime on her AoE heals. You can imagine that if a comp would play even a little bit slower or more spread out, the Brig wouldn't be able to get that much Inspire. Even in many comps where Brig is meta, she can't really get Inspire that often, mostly just kind of whipping the Winston or whatever, and just has to get it when she can and play back and pocket her other support. But in this comp, the Brig could actually get Inspire very reliably, which was useful. It's also possible that Rally was better, especially because Queen ult was, then as now, an incredibly strong ult that could single-handedly win team fights, and Coalescence doesn't really do anything against it. Whereas Rally, because it adds overhealth rather than healing, actually could. And Beat is a no-brainer, frankly. I mean, Lucio's a no-brainer no matter what he does, because he just gives you speed for a rush comp. We see here, this was a double main support meta, Lucio Brig. And you also see on Soul a trend that was seen throughout the league at this time, was that Brig in this comp, a lot of times this comp would actually deprive a team of a really useful shot caller or in-map presence, because, you know, maybe your flex support would go away, or in this case, Stalker was the best Genji and Fitz was the best Sojourn. but Prophet is such an important in-game leader, and this comp prioritized coordination so hard over raw mechanics, especially on the supports in the tank, that a lot of teams would experiment with putting other players on Brig, or even other players on Lucio. Moreover, for the real old head flex DPS who were still in the league at this time, many of them had an extensive experience playing Brig in a highly coordinated rush comp in Goats. Prophet played Brig in Goats, so it was also kind of a reasonable way to awaken and utilize these skills that were just sitting around in his brain. But anyway, again, the expectations of supports continued to get a little more fluid in this time. Sometimes a flex support even would be expected to go Lucio if they wanted the main support on Brig, or the flex support would be expected to go Brig, things like that. Moreover, other teams did even stranger things with their lineups. The Florida Mayhem took one look at this meta and eventually realized that they simply couldn't hack it. And I don't blame them for making this assessment, especially because they knew or figured that Junker Queen would be nerfed after this stage to a point that they wouldn't actually need to learn this meta for the rest of the season. So Florida made the bizarre decision to bench their main support in a double main support meta and would play Surma Jed RuPaul. They had Animo on this roster, the seasoned Lucio of the Florida Mayhem, but kept him on the bench for two reasons. One, as you see on your screen right now, Mayhem played this weird variation because they knew that they couldn't really win in mirrors most of the time because they simply weren't good enough at the meta and didn't think it was a worthwhile investment to learn. They would play this bizarre Ana Zen variant that basically played it like a poke comp, but because Junker Queen was the only viable tank, just had to have a queen. Mayhem would still, when they had to, play Lucio Brig because sometimes they had no choice as much as they wished they could flex. I can probably find it if I skip around a bit. And yeah, this variation, you see they have Surma Jed, a career flex support, playing Lucio, and RuPaul, a career flex support, playing Brig, because experience be damned. They knew that this simply wasn't a very mechanically demanding backline to have, and they wanted to try and force a variation as much as possible. Likewise, on London, we see Landon, a flex support player to this day, playing Brig. So this queen comp was an early example of the rigid divide between the two sub-roles of support being eroded gradually over time. In general, I would say, this change, like all historical changes, will not happen with a snap of fingers overnight. Rather, it happens gradually. It will slowly erode away. The difference between main support and flex support will slowly erode away. Individual players will take the lead, but everyone will kind of gradually, slowly follow. And for a while, the categories of flex support and main support, as we see today, will not cease to exist. We won't say, oh, there's just two support players or there's two flex support players, but they will start to become suggestions or broader, more amorphous categories than rigid prescriptions. Rather than the main support only plays Lucio, it will be a main support must play Lucio, but any extra must play Lucio Brig Mercy, but any extra heroes are very much appreciated. Or a main support is expected to play 4 heroes instead of just 3. Things like that. And even in 2023 season, these changes have already began to gradually come into view. The Florida Mayhem is one example. Chorong has been a real trailblazer in this regard. We see here Chorong was flexing onto Kiriko quite a bit. Another thing, in fact, that will really cause these roles to inevitably erode a bit as time passes is the introduction of new characters. The introduction of Ramatra, for example, gave us a rush tank that gave himself his own speed boost. When Ramatra presses left shift, he has his own speed boost. He still likes having Lucio, but it makes Lucio less than necessary. And so Chorong, especially on a long range map where he can take long angles, just play Kiri, and they just play an Ana Kiri composition. Now, I actually don't think Florida win this map, but I could be wrong. You see the efficacy of it or why they'd bother, and it's really useful because Kiriko was still really strong, but then so was Ana, or like so was Ana and Ramatra because Nano Ram left shift was so broken. Just said screw it. Moreover, Kiriko could charge her ult pretty fast. And then Kiriko ult was all the speed they needed. Why amp in with Lucio or do a beating gate? You could just use Kiriko ult. Things like that. Whether you like it or not, I would argue, the distinction between main support and flex support, or at least the main support having to play an incredibly small pool of heroes and nothing else, is going to go away. And the question to all main support players, I would argue, is how you're going to adapt to this. I mean, if you only want to play Lucio because Lucio is the only character that you find fun, you're welcome to, and especially at lower levels, you can absolutely force whatever you'd like if you're good enough. But for the top level, you simply will see more flexibility as time passes. And I don't just want to look at the introduction of new characters or the changing in hero balance, though this is important. Another important thing we should consider is hero bans, which are now added to OWCS. Look at the Esports World Cup. I'm using a co-stream here so I can try to avoid giving the actual stream runners any sort of money or attention if I can help it, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with the ethical difficulties of having a Saudi-funded and hosted tournament. But look, now we're already seeing teams are forced to play Flashpoint, this map where Lucio is incredibly important, with Lucio banned. Main supports already are expected to have an Illari on them. Vega and Violet are Illari mirroring on Flashpoint. This is the brave new world of support picks that we're going into, especially with hero bans. Players like Vega, Violet, and Chorong, who have an excellent Lucio on them, but also deep pockets of other characters, are not exceptions, but the new rule. The vanguard of the best main supports in the world are already becoming more and more flexible at a quick rate. So if you're a main support player and you're tired of Lucio, or you think it feels pointless or silly that you have a good Zen or have a good Illari in your back pocket, don't be. This is an important skill that works to your advantage, and if you keep honing it, it will pay off, especially as we just keep seeing new metas, different metas, new heroes, and hero bans. So I guess my closing message here to the main supports of the world is to take heart and to not be ashamed of switching off Lucio in ranked if it gets you more wins. Add an Illari or a Kiriko to your hero pool, especially if you feel like you need it and you think you can devote the time to learning them. Because like it or not, this is the brave new world of hero picks that we're jumping into now for the support. Tank as a role already saw this. And really every role sees this. Tank had it accelerated very quickly by the removal of the second tank. And so now, if you were to hack it as a tank player, you had to learn whichever heroes you didn't know. You know, Hanbin has to play Winston now. Hanbin has to play JQ now. Main tank players, you know, someone has to have a Zarya and a D.Va on him now. Things like that. Likewise, for the DPS, this has also changed quite a bit. For a while, only the Flex DPS or only the hit skin had to know Tracer. Now it's important for both people to have a Tracer. It's important for both DPS to have a Sombra, things like that. Like it or not, the roles, especially at the highest level of play, are continuing to merge, homogenize, the lines are continuing to blur. And hero pools will only exacerbate this further. If there's nothing else I would take away from this video, it's my thesis that the main support will continue to be a vaguer and vaguer category, and main supports will be expected to play more and more heroes. So, thank you for watching. This video was a little bit less rambly and more structured. I had some ideas. I've been thinking about the fact that the sub-role distinctions have been eroding for a long time, and I wanted to kind of put together a brief compilation of ways this has happened, the antecedents for this, and where it might go from here. So, I hope you enjoyed, and making this video also gives me some good ideas for future videos. Like I said, weird tank duos, or you know, a feature on Winston Sigma or something could be interesting. Talking about the way other roles as subdivisions have started to go away. We'll see. And this is also my first video that actually brings in Overwatch 2 and the current state of Overwatch esports, which is something I still keep up on as much as I can. I still play the game, so I hope this was good. And I'm excited for OWCS to start this season so that I can have footage of hero bans gameplay that doesn't involve Esports World Cup. Soup Cup is out there, but you know. That's another thing, actually, before I leave, is that Juno has made it so that Lucio doesn't even have a monopoly on speed anymore. You want to see something that's changing the landscape of hero pools? That's a big one right there. That there's another way to get speed boosts on a cooldown now from a support. So, yeah. With that, I will leave you, my viewers. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I hope this video was a little more professional, structured, and higher quality than my first outing. But this is a learning experience. It's a fun learning experience. I think it's important to create things, put myself out there. And as the unfortunate lack of Arab dive VODs from European contenders shows, I hope I can perform, if accidentally and along the way, the role of archivist for this scene, because you never know with the internet, with link rot, with the constant changes you see in live service games, when things will go away or disappear. And it's important to have this, even unintentionally, as a testament to all that. So thank you.